Good morning. I'm certainly very pleased and happy to be here, and it's a great honor for me to address such a prestigious and erudite audience as the Doctors for Disaster Preparedness. Suppose that I was a United States congressman, and suppose further that I was not a particularly principled United States congressman, although for some of you that may be redundant. And suppose I had it in my mind, along with my congressional buddies, to spend $900 billion on the general welfare. Well, for those of you who are more cynical about these things, suppose we had it in our minds to spend $900 billion to shower some benefits upon particular constituent groups in order to buy votes and assure our continued re-election. Being astute politicians, and we must be astute since we're in the Congress, we know that if we were to raise taxes in order to get that $900 billion, there would be bad feeling among our constituents and others, and it would be counterproductive. Well, fortunately for the politicians, and unfortunately for all of us, they don't have to raise taxes to get that $900 billion because we have in our society a fiat money system. Fiat money being money that's created flat out of nothing. And so what they do in this particular instance is they pass the necessary legislation.
Mic's off. Mic is off.
Let me see what's going on here. Try it now. Just reorient this over there. Okay.
I was up to the part where the politicians do not have to raise taxes in order to get the money in our society, because in our society we have a fiat money system. A fiat money system means the money is created flat out of nothing. So what they do is they pass the necessary legislation and then send it over to their employees at the Treasury Department, and the people at the Treasury type up a U.S. government bond. Think of it in terms of an IOU. In this particular instance, the people from the Treasury Department then go to a small group of private companies, and this is very crucial. These companies are privately held. They're called banks. And they say to the banks, will you please buy this $900 billion bond? And of course, the banks are delighted to do so. Now here's where this presentation begins to get interesting. Where do you suppose the banks, these private companies, get the $900 billion to buy this U.S. government bond? Well, let me first dispose of where they most certainly do not get the money. There is a common misunderstanding among people in this country and around the world that banks recirculate deposits. That we deposit monies in banks, and the banks somehow lend this money to others. Well, let me ask you a question. At the time that the banks bought, and they have in fact bought, $900 billion worth of U.S. government bonds, were any of your accounts, your checking accounts, of your savings accounts reduced by the banks? I mean, you wouldn't sit for that. Has a bank officer ever come to you and said, look, we've taken some money out of your account in order to lend it to somebody else? Of course not. And so the source of this $900 billion is certainly not deposits from other people. Now, I have a colleague in New York who's an attorney and is also the director of a small bank. And when I put this question to him, albeit in a different forum, he suggested to me that the money came from bank capital. However, the banks in this country never had $900 billion in capital. In fact, they never even had a third of that. So where did the $900 billion come from? And the answer is they created it flat out of nothing. Now, if that sounds confusing to you, that a group of private companies should be able to create money out of nothing, it is only because it is so patently outrageous. And physically, how do they do that? Well, little fingers go to the keyboards, and they type 900, followed by 9 zeros, and boom, the money's in the government's accounts. This is beyond the imagination of any 15th or 16th century alchemist who spent a lifetime trying to change, say, a lump of lead into gold. For those of you who are into accounting and understand a little bit about T accounts, on the left side, on the asset side of the T account, is the $900 billion bond. And on the right-hand side, the liability side, is the $900 billion that the banks create. Well, you might ask, once the money gets taken out of the banks, aren't these accounts going to be out of balance? And that's part of the beauty of this. Because when the government sends you a check, say for Social Security, or to buy something from you, what do you do with the check? Well, every time you get a check, it gets deposited into a bank. And so the $900 billion, in effect, never leaves the banking system. They have a particular name for this process of money creation, just to confuse you. It's called fractional reserve lending. But in essence, it is money creation. And so our erstwhile politician, in effect, did not have to raise taxes to get the $900 billion. He was able to get it without raising taxes. Does this sound like the kind of thing that President Reagan did? Now, as good a deal as this is for the politicians, this is a fantastic deal for the banks. Why is it fantastic for them? Because in return for this amount of work, keying in this $900 billion, they get interest every year on the bonds which they can spend. And in effect, our government collects from the taxpayers, from you, approximately $50 billion a year, which they give to the banks for essentially no work that the bankers can spend. Now that's a business. There are people in this country, maybe even some people in this room, who decry the so-called welfare state. They object to the notion of transferring wealth from people who earn it to people who don't earn it. And typically when you hear speeches about this, they decry things like the food stamp program for people who don't have enough to eat, the school lunch program for little kids who don't have enough to eat for lunch, the Aid to Dependent Families program, and certainly you hear talks in the Congress against people who could and arguably should work. But what about this little piece of welfare, transferring $50 billion a year to the banks? Where are the libertarian and conservative and Republican voices objecting to this? I don't hear them. And could this possibly be constitutional? Well, under our Constitution, the Congress itself does not have the power to create money out of nothing, and somehow the Congress has delegated a power which it does not have to the banks. In the back of the room, there's a terrific article about this called The Forgotten Role of the Constitution in Monetary Law. It's written by famed Foundation scholar Edwin Vieira, who's a Harvard-trained constitutional lawyer who spent his lifetime on this issue. Anybody who didn't get a copy, you can get it off our website, fame.org, or if you give me your email, we'll send you one. Now, this business of creating money out of nothing does not stop here with the commercial banks monetizing U.S. government debt. Suppose a politician needs yet or wants yet another $450 billion. Same process, passes the legislation, the Treasury Department types up the bond, but in this second case, instead of going to the commercial banks, the Treasury Department goes to their quasi-employee, Alan Greenspan, at the Federal Reserve, and they say to the Fed, will you please buy this $450 billion bond? And as you may know, the Federal Reserve is the fiduciary agent, fiscal agent for the Treasury Department. And so the Federal Reserve says, sure. And where does the Federal Reserve get the money to buy this $450 billion bond? These are actual numbers, folks. That's what's on the balance sheet. Again, little fingers go to the keyboard, type in 450, followed by the 9 zeros, and poof, another $450 billion has appeared. However, there's an important difference when the Federal Reserve monetizes U.S. government debt as opposed to when banks do it. And that difference is that the Federal Reserve refunds back to the Treasury the interest that these bonds pay. So in effect, it is as if the federal government created this money itself. Actually, they don't turn back all the money, they subtract their expenses. More needs to be said about that. In addition to monetizing debt of the federal government, every time anyone takes a loan from a bank, that money is also monetized. That debt is also monetized. So if I'm Citibank and you come to me, say, for a $300,000 mortgage, where do you suppose Citibank gets that $300,000 from? Same place they got the money to buy the government bonds. Little fingers go to the keyboard and type up $300,000 into the account, and the money's created out of nothing. So whenever you read about banks extending credit is equivalent to and means creating money. And how much money have the banks in this country created? Well, since 1950, on a base of about $150 billion, they have created, as we speak, a little bit over $5 trillion, all flat out of nothing, on which they get interest and fees. And since the end of 1991, they have created roughly $2 trillion. Last year alone, they have created $500 billion. For those of you who are mathematically inclined, you can see that the increases in money creation are going up almost exponentially. And as you might imagine, this is a very unstable situation, and the bankers know it and have always known it. And so they have really improved on this deal for themselves, if improvement is even conceivable. And they have colluded with the politicians and passed legislation that provides for them 2 safety nets. Let me talk about these. And every safety net, by the way, involves a subsidy. And by definition, a subsidy involves wealth transfer. And since, by the way, the bankers are generally more well-to-do than the rest of the population, this wealth transfer is taking place from poorer people to richer people. I call it stealing from the poor to give to the rich. It's sort of like Robin Hood in reverse. Well, the first safety net they have is where the taxpayers, in effect, guarantee their assets. Their assets are the loans that they have on the books. You know what this safety net is. It's called the lender of last resort facility at the Federal Reserve. It's their bailout facility. And so the notion is, if somehow their assets, their loans, get into trouble, not a particular loan, but if somehow system difficulties appear, then the taxpayers, you folks, through this so-called lender of last resort facility, bail them out. In effect, we replenish their balance sheets. And by the way, every time money is created in this fashion, it dilutes the purchasing power of money that's already been saved. So in effect, we're really, to use the vernacular word, we're really stealing from the savers. This business of guaranteeing their assets leads to what's known, what Alan Greenspan calls, moral hazard. What moral hazard is that the people who are taking the risks get the rewards if the risks work out. However, if the risks get into trouble and fail, then somebody else makes up the losses. It's as if we sat you all down at a poker game, and I say to you like this: play the game. If you win, you keep your winnings. If you lose, the taxpayers will make up your losses. I mean, who would stand for something like that? And the banks, they're quite smart about this. Knowing that they have this backup, that their assets are protected, they have gotten involved in other activities other than lending money. Perhaps one of the more famous ones is derivative gambling, where they actually make bets. And today, depending upon who you speak to, the amount of derivative gambling that they've engaged in is somewhere between 60 and 70 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars. Now, when you and I were kids, these kinds of numbers were reserved for astronomy. Nobody talked about trillions, 60 trillion in financial matters. And again, if they win these derivative bets, they keep the winnings. If some catastrophe should happen and they lose them, without limit, you replenish their balance sheets. They also have gotten involved in something called currency trading. And if you look at Citibank, not to pick them out in particular, but if you look at Citibank's annual report for last year, they took in roughly $2 billion on trading. What is trading? It's just subsidized gambling by the rest of us. You've heard, by the way, our politicians and people like Newt Gingrich and others talk about how free markets are proliferating around the world and how we have free markets here in the United States. Does any of this sound like a free market innovation to you? I don't think so. The second safety net we provide for the banking system is where we guarantee their liabilities, the deposits. This is known, and you all have heard of this, it's called federal deposit insurance. And the notion is that somehow, if the bank should lose their deposits, that other taxpayers will come to the rescue and replenish those. Now, this business of banks creating money has been around since the inception of banking. It's unfair, it's unjust, but they always did it. The difference today, as opposed to the last century, is that with some limitations in the 1900s, bank officers and directors were personally liable to depositors in the event that they lost the money. And so naturally, they took fewer chances. Today, they don't have that liability. You have that liability. Well, the picture that I've painted for you about the banking system is not a happy picture. And it's not fair that we subsidize them and transfer wealth from working people to rich bankers. And by the way, when all this money is created, this $5 trillion, the Wall Street community gets the transaction fees. And so the whole financial sector has profited improperly off working people. But some folks say to me, well, what's the problem? I mean, it may be unfair, but you know, life is unfair. And meanwhile, we're living pretty well. We live in nice homes. We eat well. We got good medical care. Here we are in this nice resort with nice people. Interest rates are down. Unemployment is at 30-year lows. The economy is booming. The stock market's booming. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that every fiat money system since the 8th century in China has collapsed. Why should a monetary innovation that has not worked for 1,200 years suddenly work now? Beats me. The reason that fiat money systems always collapse is because whenever bankers or politicians are left in charge of the integrity of fiat money, the temptation to manipulate that money for their own benefit has been so overwhelming that in 100% of the cases, no exceptions, they have always driven the purchasing power of that fiat money to its cost of production, which is zero. Indeed, our politicians and our central bankers have already succumbed to this temptation. And since 1950, our dollar has lost more than 90% of its purchasing power. Why does any thinking person think that the last 10% is sacrosanct? Well, some people feel that the Federal Reserve will save the day, and they have tremendous faith in Alan Greenspan. One of the contradictions, I think it's a contradiction, is that since the demise of the evil empire, there has been a general consensus among economists that central planning doesn't work. Now, I'd like to see a show of hands. How many people in this audience would agree with the proposition that central planning doesn't work? Just about everybody raised their hand. Did anybody not raise their hand? Does anyone think central planning works? We have one person, one and a half people out of about 200. Well, if you agree that central planning doesn't work, then why should our central bank, the Federal Reserve, have any more success than any other central planner? The fact of the matter is, all over the world, fiat monies are melting, wherever you look. In Thailand, in Indonesia, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in South Korea, in Russia, in Mexico. And as these fiat monies melt, the savings, the workers' savings denominated in these fiat currencies disappear. And also interest rates start to go to double and sometimes triple-digit rates. Commercial relationships that were predicated upon lower interest rates start to unravel and companies start to close. and the workers lose their jobs. So picture this. A bunch of folks following the rules, doing what they're supposed to do, working their whole lives, say like in Japan or South Korea, saving a lot of money. All of a sudden, through no fault of their own, their savings get wiped out and they lose their jobs. And so what happens when these fiat monies melt is that many times you get a regime change. And that regime change is, in most cases, many cases, not for a freer society, but rather for a more statist totalitarian society. Well, what's the solution to this? The solution has been and continues to be commodity money. Fiduciary money being money that's exchangeable or redeemable into commodity money. And the commodity money of choice for all history, when it's available, is gold. And what you have when you have commodity money is you have a stable system. People's savings don't melt away because the gold doesn't melt away. And since politicians need to tax money in order to spend whatever they want to spend, you tend to get more limited government because people resist taxation. And you tend, therefore, to get a freer society. And also, you tend to get lower interest rates. There's a guy by the name of Ken Fisher who wrote a book called The Wall Street Waltz. It's a book of charts. And he showed that from the year 1740 to 1920, roughly, in Great Britain, when they were almost continuously on the gold standard, that interest rates were pretty much 3.5%. I mean, why shouldn't we have a monetary system that gives us the lowest possible interest rates? And since interest rates are lower and people can have confidence in the medium of exchange for future payment, generally you have a longer planning horizon, which means you can get involved in much long-term activities. So you have more science, you have more manufacturing, you have more manufacturing jobs, you have a higher standard of living, and you have a more peaceful society. So if honest money, commodity money, is so much better, why are we stuck with fiat money? Only one economist, maybe a couple of economists, have touched on this properly, people like von Mises and Rothbard and a handful of others. But it took a genius financier, George Soros, to actually boil it down into one sentence. And to paraphrase Soros, the reason that we don't have commodity money, gold as money in our society, is that it is incompatible with the ability of banks to create money out of nothing. And over the past 100 years, and maybe even longer, the banking people have colluded with politicians to get rid of commodity money. Well, what's to be done? Well, Thomas Jefferson had it right. And the answer is you really need to shine a light on this, and people will do the right thing. At FAME, we recognize that in order to get social change here in America, and this is a fact, the media sets the agenda. We have no leadership in the putative sense. It's not like you folks run companies and you get up in the morning, you tell your employees what to do and they do it. It's not like you're in the army and the colonel or the general or whomever tells the troops what to do and they do it. That's not the way it works. Our so-called leaders are poll takers. They wake up in the morning, they put their fingers in the wind, they say, which way is the wind blowing? That's the way they're blowing. Or to put it another way, they walk around and look for a parade. And when they find a parade, they get in front of it and they say, this is my parade, whatever these folks are for, I'm for it. And so the challenge is to start this parade. And what we're doing at FAME is we're looking to bring media people, radio and television talk show hosts, and journalists up the learning curve on the honest money issue. Another thing I've done, is I've taken this issue to the principal victims of fiat money, working people. And I have joined two labor unions. The Workers' Education Local 189, it's part of the Communication Workers of America, AFL-CIO, and the National Writers Union, which is part of the United Auto Workers Local 1971, also AFL-CIO. And I am helped in this because in the last century, labor was solidly in the camp of honest money. And if you look in the labor periodicals, especially something like the American Federationist, which was the house organ of the American Federation of Labor, at the end of the last century, labor said gold is the hallmark of every great society. Labor said we want money that doesn't depreciate at home or abroad. Labor said You don't need legal tender laws to force people to take good money. You just need legal tender laws to force people to take bad money. Kick it out. Labor said, we want honest money. Because of the imminent perils of fiat money, the loss of our savings, the loss of our jobs, and maybe even the loss of our basic freedom, I urge you to help us achieve a fair and just monetary system. I invite you to join the fight for honest money. Thank you for your kind attention, and God bless you, and God bless our great country. I'm going to take some Q&A.
Would you comment on the actions of the Open Market Committee? Understood that they help their buddies in the financial world at churning accounts and making lots of money that way.
I assume you're talking about the federal open market operations with the federal, right? Well, this is the mechanism by which the Fed buys U.S. government securities. And supposedly, one of the reasons for the Federal Reserve when it was passed in 1913 was to provide an elastic currency. The notion was that as the season changed, you needed more currency at different times than other times. And so the Federal Reserve, when they bought U.S. government bonds through this so-called federal open market operations, they would create money and then they would sell the bonds and take the money back. But in effect, if you look at the Fed balance sheet continues to grow. And one of the things I didn't say in this presentation is that as the Federal Reserve buys these bonds, that money, when it gets into the banking system, forms what's called the so-called reserves. Let me tell you, folks, this is all a bunch of hokey pokey. The essence of this is that the banking system, the Federal Reserve, and the banks create money out of nothing. The amount of money, though, that's created by the Federal Reserve is small compared to that which is created by these private companies, the banks. So if you look at the totality of money creation since World War II, it's roughly about $5.6 trillion. Of that, roughly $450 billion was created by the Fed, and over $5 trillion was created by the banks. The source of this, by the way, is the Federal Reserve Flow of Funds reports, and you want to look at Series L109. Yes, sir.
Jude Wanniski wrote a book called The Way the World Works. And he and Jack Kemp and others have been pushing for the gold standard and for the ability for all of us to exchange our dollar bills in return for silver or gold. And this all evolved into supply-side economics. Is that what you're talking about?
It is not what I'm talking about. And Jude Wanniski these days talks about pegging the dollar to gold, not redeeming the dollar in gold. As a matter of fact, what we would like to see is gold as money. And if you look at the definition of the dollar, it's only been defined in the Currency Act of 1792, it is an equivalent of silver. And so the notion isn't that the dollar is redeemable into gold or silver or exchangeable. The dollar is silver. And so really what you want the money to be some unit, some measure of gold or silver. Mostly, by the way, Jude Wanniski has this pretty much right.
Let me tell you my view of money, which is the government has absolutely no business being in the money business. Just as we should rely on the butcher for our meat and the baker for our bread, etc., so should we rely on free banking to supply us with money. The government should not even mandate gold, for example, as a standard. If Joe's bank wants to base their money on wheat and other commodities, that should be their business. In fact, Hayek wrote a book about this, 1961, called The Nationalization of Money. I'm sure you're familiar with it. In essence, it should be absolutely free banking. Would you comment on this?
That's absolutely right, and I agree with you 100%. And I didn't really get to talk in this presentation about how gold becomes money. And gold does not become money because some government dictates it so. It turns out that gold has evolved as money because it is the most efficient medium of exchange. And if you had free banking, and free banking, by the way, is the ideal, which is what we want, you would have some commodity as money, and people should be able to choose whatever they wish. And if people want to choose wheat or silver or cattle or salt or whiskey or tobacco, all of these things, by the way, at some point were money, they should be free to do so. But in fact, people do choose gold, again, because gold is the most efficient medium of exchange. In the Constitution, the government is given the power to coin money. They're not given the exclusive power to create money.
I'm not good at economics or anything, but I've had a sneaking suspicion that whatever the freemen were doing in Montana was analogous to what the larger boys are doing. Would you care to comment on that?
I don't know a great deal about it, but I have read some stuff, and they were mindful that the Federal Reserve and the banking system were creating money out of nothing. And from what I've read, and again, I don't have perfect information on this, they figured, well, if they can create money out of nothing, why can't we?
Yeah, well, for instance, I mean, they gave almost no coverage to that trial, but they said, oh, these people were accused of bilking the public or something of billions of dollars. Well, obviously, billions of dollars did not flow to these people, or they wouldn't be in jail. So maybe the bankers would love them. But I was just trying to figure, I mean, they really hate competition, put it that way.
They really hate competition. That's exactly right. Yes, sir.
There's a lot of disinformation out there in banking, and one of the things that is commonly said, and I'd really like to find out if there's any truth to it, is that this whole concept was a European concept, and there are two classes of stock in the Federal Reserve, A and B, and A is all owned by European bankers, and they're making tremendous profits on this. Is there any truth to that, or is that simply part of the disinformation?
That's really, even if there is a little bit of truth in the sense that the stock of the Federal Reserve is owned by, private banks, and at least one or two of those private banks have European parents. However, that whole notion is really just a smokescreen. And the reason you have the Federal Reserve, the reason it was formed in 1913, was to provide this so-called lender of last resort facility. And the basic problem with banking is that the essence of the relationship that the banks have with the people is at best a misrepresentation and at worst a fraud. Let me explain that a little more. When people put money in banks, they are led to believe that it's their money. When in fact, and in law, when you put money in a bank, it becomes the bank's money. And it is the bank's money to do with as the bank wishes. This has been the ruling of the courts since the middle of the 18th century. However, the banks mislead the people about this because, number one, they don't call it a loan to the bank, which in effect what it is. It goes on the bank's balance sheet, by the way, as a liability. They call it a deposit. And secondly, they tell the people that you can get your money on demand. And so what happens is once the deposits, really loans to the bank, go into the banks do stuff with that money. They leverage it up with this so-called fractional reserve lending ability. And a lot of times they get into trouble with this fractional reserve lending. In essence, the fractional reserve lending is money creation. But since the money is a commodity and they're creating money out of nothing, if people should go to the bank to get their money, there's clearly not enough commodity to go around. So all through the 19th century, you have these little bank runs around America and around the world. However, while you had these bank runs, in the aggregate, less than 1% of depositors' money was lost. So depositors really didn't have a lot of downside even with this system. And the reason depositors didn't have a lot of downside, again, is because bank officers and directors, with some limitations, were personally liable to depositors. But come 1907, there was a horrendous bank run. And even though, by the way, depositors didn't lose, a lot of times the bankers themselves lost everything. And so after the big bank run in 1907, where Morgan had to bail out the system, these folks looked around and said, well, maybe the federal government, could bail us out. And that's why the Federal Reserve got passed, in order to provide this lender of last resort facility in order to mute the deleveraging when there were bank runs. And so this whole business about who owns the Federal Reserve and whatnot, it's really just a smokescreen. In essence, the function of the Federal Reserve is to replenish the balance sheets of banks when they get into trouble. And who cares who owns the Federal Reserve? It doesn't make any difference. They don't take out any dividends. It's meaningless.
I can remember maybe 25 years ago, Alan Greenspan used to write articles advocating the gold standard, sounding a lot like you. Do you know where he stands now and what's happening now?
Yeah. Thanks for asking that question. 30 years ago, Alan Greenspan wrote a terrific article called Gold and Economic Freedom, which was printed in Ayn Rand's Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. We have that speech, by the way, in full text on our website, fame.org. And about 3 years ago, I had conversation with Alan Greenspan, and I asked him whether he still agreed with the reasoning and the conclusions in that article. That article, by the way, he took the position that gold is a precondition, gold as money is a precondition for a free society, for the reasons that I've outlined in my talk. And he said to me, right to my face, absolutely. And I said to him, well, why don't you speak out? And he said, because my colleagues at the institution that I represent disagree with me. I mean, the man doesn't use proper nouns anymore. And then I said to him, but you know where all this is leading to. And he gave me one of these really sour looks, and he walked on. Since that time, Alan Greenspan has been ringing the bell on these issues. And in January 14th of last year, he gave a speech in Belgium, which I call his whistleblower speech, where he just lays it all out. He talks about systemic breakdown. He talks about how gold would prevent a blow-up of the system. He talks about the subsidy that the taxpayers are providing to the banking system. Two things about this speech. First of all, he gave this speech out of the country in Belgium. It was not covered by our press. Secondly, and more important, he said this all in Fed speak. So who even knows what he's talking about? So when he was talking about creating money out of nothing, he talks about creating claims. Well, at Fame, we've taken this speech, was roughly a 6 or 7 page speech, and we have annotated it and translated the Fed speak into English. It's now a 72-page document. And anybody who wants that document, if you just send me your email, we'll send it to you in PDF Acrobat format. And you can see what Alan Greenspan's position could be. And by the way, he is the only official in the government who talks about this stuff the same way I'm talking about it. He doesn't use the words justice and fairness, but you don't have to really be a genius to read into what he's saying and say to yourself, well, is that fair? And the answer is, it's not fair. Yes, ma'am.
As chairman of the Arizona Libertarian Party, I must tell you that the Libertarian Party has always been opposed to fiat money and has always advocated a return to the gold standard, the whiskey standard, whatever has value. But since that attitude seems to be a little more, well, boring compared to some of the rest of our views, it's very hard for us to get the press to write anything about it. I would like to ask you, what are your views on how this fiat system will be affected by Y2K?
Potentially, the Y2K, this is the notion that the banking system is not prepared for the change over to the year 2000 because of technical issues relating to how they programmed up their computers. Years ago, I worked for IBM, and I have an extensive background in data processing. And my prediction is that they solve this Y2K problem, and that it will not be the problem that the pundits are talking about. I don't see any reason why the banks can't write checks with the year 1900 on them. You'll all know that the 1900 means 2000. Just like when they changed the postage stamps from 29 cents to 32 cents, they didn't know what it was going to be. They put an A on the postage. Everybody knew it was 32 cents. Nothing's going to shut down, in my view. It makes for a lot of ad copy, but I don't think it's a problem. I'm glad to hear, by the way, that the Arizona Libertarian Party supports honest money, gold is money. I just don't hear any speeches from libertarians about this issue, Ron Paul being an exception. In the literature that I get from the National Libertarian Party, I don't see them mentioning it. And nowhere have I seen any libertarians condemn the wealth transfer that takes place from working people to the banking system. I have never seen anything on that. The only person that's written on this in any way that's understandable to me is Murray Rothbard. Yes, sir.
Is what you say true of, for example, Swiss banks? In other words, are there any exceptions? Are there any good banking systems in the world?
The Swiss banking system is better, but they have a problem too. The Swiss, while they don't redeem their Swiss francs into gold, they have by legislation limited the amount of money that can be created in the sense that they have gold backing. However, this whole issue with central banks having gold is really to fool the people. I mean, one of the things that the Federal Reserve has done is they have kept alive somehow, not for this crowd, this is a very erudite crowd, and I know you know this, there is no relationship at all between our money and gold. This is not the perception that ordinary Americans have. And when you go to the New York Federal Reserve Bank in downtown Manhattan, and you take the tour, one of the highlights of the tour is to go into the sub-basement, and they say, look at all this gold. There is a mountain of gold there. The implication is that somehow the gold is related to the currency. And now that they're forming a new currency in Europe, the euro, they're going to conglomerate all the currencies. One of the issues for the gold industry is, well, how much gold is the central bank going to have in order to, quote, maintain confidence? But since there is no relationship between the gold that they have or do not have and the money, the whole thing is just a smokescreen to fool the people. Yes, Mr. York.
Some 200 years ago, after the French Revolution, the Revolutionary Committee created a new currency where the basis was a fraction of francs, under the opinion that this was the ultimate security you could ever have for your money. Was that idea flawed, or why did it fail?
Well, it was obviously flawed. This was the basis of the French assignats. And the notion was, after the French Revolution, that the land that they had seized from the church would form the backing for the currency. Well, it turns out that that is not a good fiduciary currency because you really can't redeem it for land. The land isn't fungible. Money has certain money-ish characteristics. One of the characteristics is that it be divisible, that it be recognized as money, that it be fungible, that it doesn't obsolete. Land obviously has a value, but it really doesn't fit these money-ish characteristics. And in effect, once they started doing that, they started issuing more and more of this so-called back currency, and there was a big monetary collapse, which led to Napoleon. And when Napoleon came in, by the way, one of the things he did, he said, we're going to have a gold franc. Okay.
I'm Bob Chiak from Washington State, and I think the French peasants, at least Richard Ebling writes that the French peasants burned the money printing presses, which stopped the inflation temporarily.
Right.
But on the idea of a true commodity-based currency, Peter Huber had an article in Forbes magazine 2, 3, 4 years ago. One page said, our current system amounts to essentially a 3% tax on the public. I'm sure it's available on his own website or maybe through forums. Also, in there he promulgates the idea that with computers and international communications being what they are, in theory it would be very simple to have a very, very broadly based currency based on a basket of thousands of different commodities. I've heard one of the Getty boys, I'm not sure, I forget which one, speak at a Cato conference in a similar fashion, and Richard Rahn has a book in manuscript that I've read that also describes the potential for cyber cash. Have you seen any concrete proposals, or are there any cyber cash mechanism extant that would implement this? This would be even much more broadly based than gold, and infinitely more transportable.
Yeah, I've met Mr. Ron, and I've seen a lot of this stuff. And again, I come out, I don't know, this gentleman who spoke about free banking, that's where I come out. And the people should be able to choose whatever they wish as money. I don't want to see any government say you have a basket of commodities or a basket of this being money. What you're going to have is arbitrage, and the whole thing's going to break down. Cyber cash is just credit. It's just like a check is just credit. It's a promise to pay. People should be able to choose in a democracy what they wish for money. And again, the money of choice, again, no matter where you drop it on the planet, in the 8th century in the Aztecs in South America, or the Babylonians in biblical times, or the Chinese in the 12th century, or the British in the 18th century, you find these people using gold as money. Now ask yourself a question. How is it that all these people somehow settled on gold? It's not like someone came down from outer space and said everybody use gold. The reason they use gold is because it's the most efficient medium of exchange. And if people are all left to choose what they wish, they will choose that again, I predict, but they don't have to. But I would not like to see the government impose any kind of basket of currencies or whatnot. All that's too easy for them to manipulate to the detriment of the rest of us. Yes, sir.
Given the problem with banks that you have described it, that we actually don't have deposits, but we're loaning them the money, would you recommend that people, if they can, avail themselves of credit unions that are supposedly cooperatives where all the members put their money in to help each other out?
It really wouldn't make a difference. The whole credit union business is just a pimple, on an elephant, today. You're still stuck with the fiat money. You're still stuck with the legal tender laws. I mean, that quote from Labor, that was a very prescient quote that they had back in the 19th century. If the money that we have is good, then why do you need legal tender laws? I mean, if people would accept it anyway, why do you need forced tender laws? The only reason you need forced tender laws is because the money is no good. And having money in a credit union or whatnot, that's not going to make any difference. Sure.
Would you comment on this situation of government-to-government loans here with the IMF? I was aware of a group a number of years ago in Central America that was trying to get a project going, a cement project, and they worked years on it, invested a lot, and then a IMF loan was made to the Honduran government, and they put in a government mandated and run plant, which turned out an considerably inferior product, and it eventually went broke, and I never followed it after that, but I would imagine that the IMF and the American taxpayers did not get refunded, but it looked at the time like, it was the Honduran government was helping the economy and entrenching itself. And I'm wondering if you comment on that.
Sure. Let me throw in the World Bank while we're doing this. Two things about the IMF and the World Bank. Firstly, the IMF today, not in those days, is being used as the lender of last resort, bailout facility worldwide, just like our Federal Reserve is used at home. But since the United States, in effect, is the largest contributor to the IMF, controls the IMF, really the purpose of the IMF these days is to protect the balance sheet of United States banks. So you have a situation like in South Korea, where the South Korean banks may go under, but what about the money that they owe to American banks? Well, our system is set up so American banks don't take the hit. And so what happens is that there is wealth transfer from American taxpayers and other taxpayers to the IMF, which funnels the money to these foreign banks so they can funnel the money back to our banks. Right? That's really what happened with the Mexican bailout, too. Now, coming back specifically to your question, the IMF and the World Bank, years ago, years ago, it was the IMF, it was their function to do as you suggest. These days, it's the World Bank's function, is to provide below market rate loans to so-called developing societies. There was only one American high executive who objected to this, and his name was George Monroe, who was then the chairman CEO of Phelps Dodge, a large copper-producing company. And I remember back in the 1980s, the Phelps Dodge was engaged in a very vociferous labor struggle. And what happened was the World Bank, maybe the IMF, had extended a below-market rate loan to Chile to build a copper mine. So really what they were doing is they were taking taxpayer money here and subsidizing foreign competition. I mean, is that crazy? This is what you're talking about, right? I mean, the whole thing is just nuts. Who would put up with such a thing? Anyway, George Monroe is the only American official executive to bring this out, and it's totally unfair. Yes, sir?
If we went over to your system of honest money, the total amount of money in circulation as well as the rate of circulation go up or go down, how would that influence standard of living if it went down?
The rate of circulation?
The total amount of money as well as the rate at which it circulates.
Most of the money today that circulates is really subsidized gambling by the banking system. And that amount today is roughly $3 trillion a day. This is the interbank transfer system for the Federal Reserve and the so-called chip system. Doesn't improve the quality of our lives in any way. It just facilitates wealth transfer to the banking system. In the event that we had honest money, generally you'd have a higher standard of living. And we have an example, by the way, in the United States when we went from fiat money to honest money, gold is money. That is, we were not continuously on gold and silver standard from the time of the Revolution. We were off honest money during the Civil War. As you may know, the Civil War was an unpopular war. Lincoln had trouble financing it, and he resorted eventually to creating money out of nothing. They were called greenbacks. And after the Civil War, there was a great deal of controversy as whether or not to go back to gold as money. Eventually, for reasons beyond the scope of today's discussion, President Grant signed the resumption legislation in 1874, and there was an enormous burst of productivity, a tremendous increase in the standard of living when we went back to gold as money. And if we went back to gold as money, if we can somehow get rid of this fiat money, and I'm sure we will get rid of it in time, we will have a tremendous surge improvement in our standard of living and a tremendous prosperity for everybody at home.
I made my first trip to Peru in 1994, and the Sole was trading at $2.17, and it's now at $2.85. Many of you met my dear wife. She understands economics about as well as the average American. She comes from a very poor city, and she is a big fan of President Fujimori, who I've also become a big fan. But her level of economic understanding runs something like this: why doesn't President Fujimori simply print some more money so that we can buy more things? My question to you is, what is keeping the Sole in Peru and other South American currencies relatively stable as it compares to the dollar? What motivates Fujimori not to run the presses? And one little add-on, when I first went down there, they had a $5 million old Sole that was convertible into a new $5 or 5 Sole unit, and those have since been replaced. But Peru, as you know, and everybody in this country, this room knows, Peru, like all the South American countries, has had a history of rampant inflation.
Right. I can't speak to Peru in particular, but I can tell you that several of the South American countries, Argentina for one, have what's known as currency boards, where they actually key their currency to the American dollar. And there are people like Steve Hanke and others who believe that the currency board solution is a solution for these depreciating South American currencies. I don't believe that. And one of the issues that one might ask is, why should the dollar, be able to support these various currencies? And the story I like to tell about this relates to the first Superman movie. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it starts with a helicopter coming into land on the top of what was then called the Pan Am building. And as it comes in for the landing, it hits a guide wire and it tips over. and Lois Lane is in the helicopter, and she falls out, and as she's falling down the Pan Am building, she's screaming her head off. She knows she's going to die, but Clark Kent is on the ground, and he sees this, and in a flash, he's in his Superman costume, and he zips up, and he catches her in midair. And the dialogue goes like this. He says, "Don't worry, miss." He says, "I've got you." And she says, "But who's got you?" Now that's the US dollar and all these currencies. So the US dollar is holding up the Hong Kong currency, it's holding up the Argentina currency, it's holding up all these currencies that are pegged to the dollar. But what's holding up the dollar? And what's holding up the dollar is that some people save it. And so the fiat money is really like a bad check. As long as the bad check is not presented, then all the bad checks can be thought to have value. But once people realize that it is a bad check, the whole stash goes to Zippo. Yes, Dr. Orion.
Thank you, Dr. Parks. I'm sorry that we didn't make enough copies of your talk for everyone to have. If we will send one to anyone who requests it if they don't want to get it from your website. But since Mr. York brought it up, I should say that this whole story of the French Revolution and trying to back the franc with a fraction of France is alluded to briefly in Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. And I want to put in a little plug for the Robinson Self-Teaching Homeschool Curriculum, where I learned about this fiat money inflation in France, which tells what a disaster this was, by Andrew Dickinson White. So I want to get a copy of that.
That book, by the way, Fiat Money in France by Andrew Dickinson White, we quote that in our stuff. It's a fabulous little book.
We'll just have these two more questions and then that'll...
Okay, Maury.
Thanks, Andrew. About your comments about Greenspan, I couldn't tell, they were factual, and I couldn't tell whether, it seemed between the lines that you left it as in a sort of approving of him, although you didn't make a judgment. That's what the impression I was left with. And I just wanted to express that if that's the case, which I'm not sure, I would take issue with it because I believe that actions speak louder than words, and what Greenspan said about his beliefs as opposed to his actions because of his buddies is equivalent, if I can make an analogy, to a doctor prescribing poison for his patients because that's the accepted cure by everyone else. I think it's an immoral and a thing that shows, an act that shows a lack of integrity, lack of courage, and I think the consequences of not acting on principle, while they're not always immediately visible, in the long run they always are, and in this case, one of them is, I think Greenspan is someone who deserves a great deal of approbation because I think he's responsible, believe it or not, and my conclusion is he's responsible for the persistent success of our president despite the corruption in his administration because Greenspan is maintaining our economy via credit expansion. He's maintaining a strong economy on paper. We're producing a lot of white elephants that are making jobs and it feels good, many of which will eventually bite the dust. And he's blowing the balloon bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's because of this that the man in the street who's ignorant continues to ignore or be less concerned or have less focus on all the other issues. As long as the economy's, during the past election, is the economy stupid? Well, essentially Greenspan, by acting against his principles, is enabling Clinton to hide behind the economy that Greenspan is maintaining and postponing the day of reckoning so that, the scandals don't seem to have the effect that they ought to have.
I think there's a good point there. I think Greenspan is conflicted on this. And I don't mean to say that I don't think I said I approve of him, and I don't approve of him. However, he has done us a big favor in laying it all out as he did in that January 14th speech last year. There is no other Fed chairman who ever said any of the things that Greenspan has said. But he does have a conflict, and by not acting on principle, arguably, he's hurt us.
We have one more question, please.
Short of sending each and every one of our Republican and Democratic national politicians to the moon on some sort of vehicle about 20% short of fuel, is there anything that a person who is willing to work 14 to 16 hours a day to maintain a reasonable standard of living for their family can do individually to offset the problem that you've talked about?
Yes, there is. There are two things people can do. The first is they can join the fight for honest money by making a contribution to FAME, which is a 501c3 not-for-profit. Dr. Orion, please forgive me for doing a little bit of fundraising. The second thing you can do is you can take it upon yourself to educate one journalist, just one. Bring them up the learning curve on these issues. Pick anybody. Now, I want to tell you something now that people generally don't know, and that's that journalists don't receive any mail. So people read something in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or some other major publication, and it doesn't sit well with them, and they zap off a letter to the editor. Well, let me tell you, the editor gets thousands of letters, and they all go in the circular file. But the journalist who writes the article generally does not get any mail at all. So if you write that person an intelligent letter, they will read it, and you can bring these people up the curve. At FAME, we have a small pamphlet called Educating the Media, and if you send me a letter or send me an email or whatever, I will send you a copy of that. Thank you all again for your time and your attention.